What other ways or what other solutions have been found?
Yeah, in my book, I have water's journey arranged sort of in chronological time. So the first chapter is about geological solutions underground, and then I've got microbes, and then beavers, and then ancient humans, in India, which I talked about. Also, I looked at an ancient culture in the Peruvian Andes that is being used again in the modern era. Then I have kind of modern humans focused on sponge cities in China, and then future humans. I looked at water towers in Kenya and coastal issues in San Francisco Bay, and also the possibility of managed retreat, which is the idea that some areas are going to be flooded in the future and we're going to need to move back from those. So, yeah, I mean, all of the examples are really fun and interesting in their own way. Um, are there any of those in particular that you'd like to hear more
I
about?
mean, Sponge City sounds sounds super interesting. What is a
Yeah, I mean,
Sponge City?
yeah, that's kind of what I was talking about earlier in terms of making urban areas more permeable to water. And this is a global movement. People are doing it all around the world. In Europe, I think they often call it like green infrastructure or natural infrastructure. But China calls it sponge cities, which I think is really evocative because, you know, a sponge absorbs water and then it can release water. And China has taken this approach national. President Xi Jinping supports it. It's been rolled out in more than 500 cities across the country. Um, and the goal is what they found was that rain that fell, only about 20% of it was infiltrating into the ground because of all the pavement. And the goal of sponge cities is for 70% of the rain to infiltrate into the ground. Um, Now, a lot of these projects, it's starting out, are maybe 5 square miles. So if you consider that some of these cities are maybe 1,000 square miles, you can understand how it's not what they've done so far is not enough to prevent flooding in cities. So sometimes you'll see headlines that, you know, China is still having urban flooding. And it's really not that surprising. You know, it is a question of scale. You think about that 87% of wetlands that we've taken away from water, and you begin to understand why we need so many small areas for water to infiltrate, like all throughout our landscapes. Um, in California, that was my example for the geological interventions, and there's a really cool feature underground called paleo valleys. And basically, during the glacial era, the water uh, carved these really deep channels coming down off the mountains into the central plain. And then later in the glacial cycle, those channels were filled with rock and cobble that kind of the water scraped off the mountains. So what that means is that you have these ancient rivers that are buried and are very close to the surface that are extremely permeable. You know, instead of being filled with like silt and clay, they're filled with rock. And so the water can move into them very quickly. And so if you're having a series of really big storms like California had last winter, if you can route some of that stormwater, that floodwater on top of these very permeable places, then the water can move underground very quickly. And then over a longer period, expand into the surrounding clays and raise the groundwater table, which is really important in agricultural places like California, where people have pumped out a lot of groundwater. And so the levels have fallen a lot. And, so much of the agriculture that we produce around the world is supported by unsustainable use of groundwater. So that means that it's getting depleted. And at some point, in various places around the world where a lot of agriculture comes from, they're not going to have access to that water anymore. So there could be really significant crashes in the global food supply if this issue is not addressed. So that using these paleo valleys to help refill groundwater when we have these big storms is one approach that California is beginning to take.